welcome back to another episode of Inside.net. I am your host, Rodney Littles, and today I am joined by a friend of mine, Brandon Minnick, .net developer advocate, code guru, and the guy that you want to talk to about all your MAUI MVVM concerns.
That's right. Well, thanks, Rodney. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Oh, anytime, man.
Having
Always
me
a
back
pleasure.
on the show.
Yeah, that was it. Anytime, man. It's always a pleasure. I love talking about stuff with other people that get it, so it's always fun.
Thanks. I hope so. I mean, I make some .NET MAUI libraries, so
right. It's not stuff that I'm going to be consuming in the very near future. So.
So hopefully I get it. Although I'm sure people in the comments will let us know how much I don't get it. But
it's okay.
That's okay.
I think you got enough of
know.
it, right? So that's what's important. So we are here today to talk about the MVVM Toolkit.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole suite of toolkits that. So I work at AWS now, but was at Microsoft for about 7 years before jumping over to AWS.
Okay.
And when I was still there was when the Xamarin/.NET MAUI team was working on creating .NET MAUI.
Yep.
And yeah, back then we had a Xamarin Community Toolkit for Xamarin developers, and there was a Windows Community Toolkit for if you're doing like WPF or WinUI stuff. And so when all this work started happening for .NET MAUI, I remember one day I reached out to David Ortnow, the PM, the head of MAUI, and it's like, hey, David, we've got this really popular library called the Xamarin Community Toolkit. And it's like, since .NET MAUI is a breaking change, like, your Xamarin libraries won't work with .NET MAUI.
Exactly.
I was like, what's your team's plan for porting this over so that it's there, so that people can use it? And he's like, well, we actually don't have the resources to do it. And long story short, since I asked, I basically volunteered for it.
Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, I basically spent the next year, obviously creating the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit, but also building this Community Toolkit org. So I reached out to Michael Hawker, who is, I call him the godfather of the Community Toolkit because he created and still owns the Windows Community Toolkit.
Nice.
And it was like, hey man, like, we've got these two things. They've got similar names. Like, they're both using .NET. Like, what can we do better? And that's when we created this org on GitHub called Community Toolkit, and basically brought a bunch of libraries into it, one of which is the MVVM Toolkit, which we'll be showing off today. But yeah, we've got Windows Community Toolkits. We've got high-performance .NET Community Toolkits, obviously .NET MAUI Community Toolkits, and they're all owned, run, supported by the community. It's all volunteer work. I'm obviously not working at Microsoft anymore, but still leading the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit. It's all just, we do it for the love of it. We create these in our spare time and nights and weekends, and hope you love them too. So yeah, for everybody that's out there watching, everything's open source. I'll share links with you so you can go find them. But if there's anything you're thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be great if they had it?
Yeah.
Come join us. Come at it. We get a lot of folks asking about future, like, are you guys gonna make this? And it's like, well, we don't have any plans to, but you can open up a pull request. Like, that'd be awesome. Yeah, we'd love to have that feature. So,
right.
I'm really excited. Even though I don't own the MVVM toolkit, somebody way smarter than me, his name's Sergio, does. But super excited to show off Sergio's hard work.
Nice. Shout out to Sergio and all your hard work, sir. We appreciate you.
That's right.
Oh, man. So are we going to jump right into it?
Yeah, if you want, we can. I can pull up some slides here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get to the jazz. I'll bring this up and add you to, and we will.
Boom. Yeah, so I'm cheating a little bit, Rodney. I just gave this presentation at Techorama in the Netherlands, in the city of Utrecht, kind of just outside Amsterdam, about 2 weeks ago. So we're using some slides here, but the first thing I want to highlight is I've got a link here, codetraveler.io/community-toolkit. So this is my website, and this Community Toolkit page is a page I put together exactly for this talk. So it's got some recordings that I've done before on the Community Toolkits, and this is where you can find the slides. This is where you can find links to all the open source repos. Like I said, they're all on GitHub in the Community Toolkit org. So if you want, you can just grab that link, and then that way you don't have to worry about memorizing anything because everything's there for you. Plus, we're being recorded here, so you can always pause and go back. But yeah, so for anybody who's maybe not familiar, there's these are the three I recommend for every .NET MAUI developer. So we have the MAUI Community Toolkit, communitytoolkit.maui. We've got communitytoolkit.mvvm, this is the one we'll be highlighting and playing around with the most today.
Okay.
And then also communitytoolkit.maui.markup. And again, full disclosure, I'm the lead and the creator of communitytoolkit.maui, communitytoolkit.maui.markup. So I am heavily biased, but I truly believe they'll make your life easier. And just a sneak peek at what you'll get in the other libraries that we won't be diving deep into today. The .NET MAUI Community Toolkit was basically created. There used to be something called the Xamarin Community Toolkit, like I mentioned earlier. And so we brought over a bunch of those features, and the whole idea behind this is like there's a lot of code that as a Xamarin developer or now as a .NET MAUI developer that we would copy paste between apps. And
all the boilerplate stuffs.
Yeah. And so, yeah, these toolkits are kind of like, hey, like, what if we just put that in one place? So like, things like we've got a bunch of converters. So how many times have you created an is null converter or like a double to int converter or like an int to bool converter that you just copy paste from all your apps? Well, we've got a bunch of converters. I don't even know how many dozens we have now that you can just add in our repo and they're already built for you. Same with things like behaviors. There's things like email validation. This is one that I did, so I'm very familiar with the nuances and RFCs of the email specification. Like, because here's the thing, Rodney. I had to write the unit tests to test this.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of weird edge cases. Like, you can use an IP address for an email address. So like, if I know the IP address of your domain, instead of using like at codetraveler.io, like I can set it to whatever the email address is. And you can do that with IPv4, you can do IPv6. There's all sorts of special characters that you can use and you can't use. So anyways, that rabbit hole goes real deep, but you don't need to worry about it because I already did. And so things like this email validation behavior, you basically attach it to an entry, which is just a text box in .NET MAUI. And then as somebody's typing in their email, it'll maybe turn red when they haven't inputted a valid email yet, and then turn green when they have, or you can use it to unlock submit buttons before they punch in a invalid email. So again, lots of great stuff just to make your life easier. Things like alerts. If you know what a snack bar or toast is on Android, those are like the little pop-ups that show up at the bottom. Like sometimes you'll see like you'll send an email and then you'll have this little like bloop pop-up appear at the bottom, and then it disappears in 3 seconds and says email sent or something like that. So those are toasts. Snack bar is a toast with a button on it. So lots of fun things that will make your life easier as a .NET MAUI developer. We're constantly adding to it. We're actually going to push out a release this week, so hopefully tomorrow, if not Friday, with even more features. So we're constantly adding to it, and if there's anything you want to bring to it, come join us. Always encourage more people. And let's see. Did I skip? There we go. Okay. So we'll circle back to the MVVM stuff because that's what we're diving deep into, but also want to continue hawking my wares here. The communitytoolkit.maui.markup library is another NuGet package, and this is one that I am very passionate about. I've been on this show before with Michael Stonis, also a friend of the show, talking about how you don't have to use XAML for your .NET MAUI apps if you don't want to. And in fact, I never do. I much prefer to do everything in C#. To me, XAML is just another learning curve that you've got to teach that new developer on your team. And everything works in C sharp. And heck, XAML compiles down to C sharp anyway. So everything you can do in XAML, you can do in C sharp. And what Community Toolkit.MAUI.markup does is provides these fluent C sharp extension methods. So makes your life super, super easy, and it makes writing UIs in C sharp just beautiful. Just the way it reads, you can write everything top to bottom, left to right, instead of the old way of having to do it. Like you would have to initialize variables up top and then manipulate them, and it just looked ugly. So this is a really great, succinct, beautiful way of creating your UIs in C sharp, and you get cool benefits like it's like bindings. You can see here our binding for this entry, which again is just a text box, is we're pointing to the actual property in our view model. We're not doing the XAML ways like curly bracket binding X colon. I don't know. It's really weird. I've never understood the ceremony in XAML, and also never understood why it hasn't gotten better. Like C sharp's come a long way in the last 20 years, but the XAML syntax seemingly has never been updated. And maybe someday.
Maybe.
but yeah, so even like here, if you've ever done like complex bindings in XAML, again, they get really complex, and like here's how it would look in C sharp, where if you're just binding to a button's is enabled property, again, you can pass in a different binding source really easily. So I created this entry called entry up here, and now I'm doing a view to view binding based on that. So I'm saying my source is this entry. I'm binding to that entry's text. And then when that text comes in, I want to convert it. And I want to make sure the text length is not 0 before I enabled my search button. So you've got to at least type one thing in before I'll let you click search. Because otherwise I'm just wasting my money on API calls for you, sending empty requests. So super, super easy. I didn't have to go create an iValue converter in another class to do this conversion. And then when you get to things like refactoring, if I ever change the name of like search bar text in my view model, well, in Visual Studio, I just right click, I say refactor. And because this is all in C sharp, Visual Studio knows how to refactor my code. Whereas I've done this before in maintaining apps that use XAML, and sometimes it does, but most of the time it doesn't update your XAML. And then all of a sudden your XAML is just broken. And if you don't have this
crashes and
runtime crashes.
Yep.
That's the worst part with XAML is like, did I do it right? I don't know. Let's run it and see what happens. Because especially before the XAML compiler and before that X data type feature came out, like you just had to guess. And like, I hope you don't have typos, because
it's magic strings, right? At that point. and nobody wins with magic strings.
But yeah, it's got to be better. I was just in a talk last week. I was speaking at a conference called Sweet Tug in Gothenburg, which amazing conference. Highly recommend it. They took us curling, so I got to go curling for the first time.
Oh wow!
But Matt Lacey, who's another amazing developer in the .NET community, gave a talk there solely on XAML and how we can write better XAML. And yeah, it wasn't till he mentioned it that I realized, like, the XAML language, the syntax has never been changed. Like we still have like these weird curly brackets. We have to spell out static resource, and it's a lot of ceremony that seems like we could do better. So if you're listening, Microsoft, give us some XAML updates, just like you update C sharp every year. But I digress, because we're here talking about MVVM stuff.
The toolkit.
Yeah. So first of all, I know I've been hawking my .NET MAUI, promoting .NET MAUI. I love .NET MAUI. I've got apps in the App Store that I build using .NET MAUI, and
nice.
But with the MVVM Community Toolkit, it's completely agnostic to your framework. So the other two libraries I mentioned, yes, those are .NET MAUI libraries, but Community Toolkit.mvvm can support anything. So it's not dependent on a framework. If you're using .NET MAUI and you want to use the MVVM architecture, great, and you probably should. You can use the MVVM toolkit. But if you're doing WinForms, WPF, anything, the Community Toolkit.mvvm just targets, .NET Standard at the lowest, so you can still use it with your .NET Framework apps. But obviously, You can use it with .NET 6, .NET 7, .NET 8,
Right.
and it doesn't matter because what we're talking about today is just MVVM stuff. It's not .NET MAUI MVVM. It's not WPF MVVM. This is just pure MVVM. So
So, so,
everybody out there
so,
can use it.
so, yeah. For the people out there that don't know what MVVM is, I'm gonna go ahead and level set. So MVVM is an application architecture that stands for model view view model, right? And I think I still know this.
Yep.
And it's a Microsoft way of writing inverted controlled apps, right? So you aren't sticking all of your logic in your code behind in your web form and checking for is post back, right? You're separating your view logic from your view itself, and you're allowing your view model to interact with sometimes domain objects that allows you to separate your application in a testable manner.
Yeah.
That's why
Exactly.
MVVM is important.
Yeah. I mean, because we always write unit tests, right? We're all good developers.
You definitely did for that email bit, yeah?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And yeah, like unit tests can't or shouldn't know about your UI. And so, yeah, breaking that code, your UI code goes in your view, your what we call the business logic goes in your view model. It's a shame that they named it a view model because we already had the word model and we already had the word view. And they're like, what do we name this new thing where we put all the business logic behind our view? And they're like, what about a view model? And it's like, okay. I mean, those words already mean something, but I guess if we mash them together, it'll be super not confusing for new developers.
Well,
But
it's supposed to be confusing, right? Like that's the whole that's why we reduce it to just 4 letters. It's just MVVM, and that's way that way it hides all the confusion.
yeah, right. But yeah, MVVM, highly recommend it because yeah, if you want to do any unit testing, your unit test shouldn't have any UI framework stuff in it. It should be just purely testing code. It's code testing code.
Yep.
And then also, as you maintain apps, like I published my first app to the App Store 2016.
Oh wow.
And I've gone through a couple iterations, and even with adding in the MVVM Community Toolkit. But yeah, there's going to be a point where you're going to change your UI, you're going to change how it looks, or you're going to add in an awesome library like this that doesn't touch your UI but only touches your business logic. And what I found in those scenarios, MVVM really shines there because you don't have to worry about changing any of your UI code if you're only working in the business logic, or if you're updating how the UI looks and how things are displayed on the screen. You can be confident that all the things will still work. Like you still have to connect your buttons back to the
Right.
commands, but as long as you wire everything back up, your view model, your code, your business logic doesn't care what your UI looks like, and so that's when it really shines. But
Mm-hmm.
it definitely sucks if you're making like your first app and it's just a one-page app. Like the one I'll be showing off today is just a pretty simple app. And I will say MVVM always feels like overkill because you're like,
Always does.
why am I doing this? Like there's so much ceremony, there's so much extra code, duplicate code, but I find that's where the MVVM toolkit really shines. So shall we jump into it? Jump into it.
Jump in. Jump in.
We're gonna dump right in.
I'm ready to go.
So basically what the MVVM toolkit does is it writes all that boilerplate MVVM code for you. So yeah, right. Like I just mentioned, when you write your code, and I have some sample code here, there's all this extra code we have to write in our view model. So for example, I have all these fields here, like a tap count. And actually, let's show the app first, because I'm actually pretty proud of this. This is just I want to create a fun app to show off the MVVM toolkit, and then I got a little carried away. But yeah, I made this game where like if you tap the button, you get 5 seconds, and you see how many taps you can get. And if you set the new high score, it shows a little pop up. That's from the MAUI Community Toolkit.
Nice.
And then if you do really poorly, like let's say I only get 1 tap in 5 seconds, so you're well below. It gives you a little like kind of sad face, like. I'm still happy for you, but we're a little sad.
Yeah. Could have done better.
Yeah, so not a complex app at all.
Right.
Not by any means. Like any
Right.
app you publish to the App Store is going to have more complexity than this. But yeah, look at all this. Look at all this code we had to write back here just because we wanted to be good developers and follow MVVM because somebody told us to, right? Like our boss or the lead developer on the team's like, nope, we always do MVVM. So yeah, the way MVVM works is there is this fun thing called I notify property changed in C sharp. So
Hmm.
it's a it's a interface that implements an event called notify property changed. And really, what's happening behind the scenes is anytime, let's see, in this case, game button text changes. I call this method called set property, which under the hood will um, see if this game button field is different than the value. And if it has changed, it'll fire this notify property changed event. And all that's going on in the view is we've got stuff bound, wired up, as I like to call it. But these
Hmm.
bindings are really just, it's just telling, in this case, .NET MAUI's binding engine what to listen for. So in
Hmm.
this case, like this label up here is just listening for any changes that happen to this property called high score. So when I notify property changes fires, when that event fires,
Hmm.
it just shouts out to the view basically, and it goes, "Hey view, there's this random property. I don't know what you do with it, but it's called high score, and I just want to let you know that its value changed." And then
Yep.
the view kind of goes down its list of everything that's got bindings. He goes, all right, do I have any bindings to something called high score? He goes, oh, I do. Okay, what do I need to update? I need to update this game label text property. And I've also got a little inline converter to include the words high score along with the actual high score numbers. So,
Hmm.
so that's really all that's going on behind the hood. MVVM seems like a lot of magic, but in reality, it's just shouting strings back and forth.
It's
And
it's just the binding engine all hinged on a single interface. Yeah. I notify
yeah,
property change. Like the whole
it's
thing is
insane.
linchpinned by I notify property change. Like that's how big it is, right? That's all MVVM comes down to.
Yeah, and so, and again, like it's just passing strings back and forth,
Yep.
and that's how we get this what we call a loose coupling. So, but yeah, the problem is to make sure that the view and the view model can shout back and forth and listen to each other. We got to add in all this ceremony. We've got to implement I notify property change. We've got to call these methods like set property. Um, only bindings can only happen to public properties. So if you
Mhm.
have a field, you can't have a binding to that field. It's got to be a public property. So
Right.
what we do? We create backing fields to support these public properties, and then
Exactly.
yeah, and then there's things like here. So there's also this concept of commands, which
Hmm.
are basically just bindable events. You know, if you think of events in C sharp, events fire when something happens, like a button tap. But you events existed before this whole logic of binding came out. So
Hmm.
if you think of a command, it's just like a bindable event that the view can send to the view model with this whole I notify property changed interface we just talked about. And so that's really all that's going on here is like we're just kind of subscribing events. And we have a couple here like this game button tapped and update the high score commands. But if we look at these, there's even things like I have a Boolean called can game button tapped command execute, which if I scroll over a little bit, this game button tap command, we can pass in a Boolean or even a method that returns a bool that ensures that this command can only execute when certain conditions are met.
Right.
And in this case, I don't want somebody spamming this game button. And actually, that was one of the first bugs I found was I was trying to get the high score, so I was getting like 50, 60, just like mashing the button. But as soon as the game ended, I get that little cool pop up that shows up, but I wasn't disabling the button. So there was like this microsecond, nanosecond in between where I could tap the button to start a new game. So I'd be mashing the button, mashing the button. All of a sudden, it would say new high score, great. But then that high score pop up would go away, and the counter was already going, and then it was like your high score for this round was 2, and I was like,
Wait a
ah,
minute.
yeah. So So I figured out like, okay, I got to actually disable this button, and don't want users to accidentally click it, and we
Right.
can do that. We can do all that with commands, but then it gets super weird because this boolean is responsible for that button being enabled,
Right.
and every time the button or this boolean changes, we now have another step where we have to let that command know that the terms inside of its can execute changed method have changed. Like it doesn't automatically detect um, that change happens. So we have to let it know every time. And since this is the Boolean we're using for it, every time that property changed, so this set property also returns a bool, true or false, if it did change. So, okay, if it did, then also let the command know. So again,
Right.
just tons and tons of ceremony here.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, this one page app, if I didn't do MVVM, my life would have been so much easier. Like I could have saved myself probably 90 lines of code. It wouldn't have been maintainable like we were talking about earlier. It wouldn't have been unit testable like we were talking about earlier. But certainly, like if I'm just doing this for a school project, I'm sitting here going,
I don't care.
yeah, like I'm trying to get an A.
Right. I don't care.
MVVM sucks. Like the teacher
Yeah.
doesn't know what they're talking about. Why would I
Right.
ever use MVVM?
Well, you brought up another word, and I kind of want to harp on it real quick. Maintainable, right? So yeah, let's get to brass tacks. If I was to be given this game to write it, I would write it in a single page. I'd write most of the stuff in a view, and I personally wouldn't care, right? And I'm an MVVM advocate. I wouldn't care. I'm just building a quick little thing to do some simple stuff, right? The problem always comes in where somebody likes what you have and wants more. And then it becomes, how do I give them more without having to put myself out, right? Because that's basically what it comes down to. How do I give the user, the client, the person requesting more what they want without having to break myself to give it to them, right?
Yeah.
And that to me is where the value of the MVVM comes in, right? Because now I'm built on top of something that's easily scalable and expandable, as opposed to something that I have no idea whether or not my changes are going to break the entire application.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I found is, let's say we're just a couple consultants, right? Somebody wanted us to show them how to do .NET MAUI, so we slap together a fun sample app like this, and you go, look, it runs on Android, it runs on iOS, and
Exactly.
MAUI's great, and MAUI is great. I don't know why I'm using that tone of voice. MAUI's great, and so we sell them on it. Um, in my experience, I found that a lot of folks will just take your code,
Mm-hmm.
copy paste it, and then
Yep.
start building on top of it.
Exactly.
And so even for simple things like this, if I'm open sourcing it or I'm sharing it with other developers, I'm still going to go through all the best practices because too many times earlier in my career
Yes.
did people take that sample I gave them, which man, it was something like quick and dirty. I knocked it out in about 15 minutes. Like,
Yep.
oh, it was nasty code. And in my head, I'm like, there's no way anybody
Nobody's gonna take
would
this.
like I can look at this code myself and go, well, that's failing a PR. I'm never going to merge
Oh,
that code. But then, next thing you know, they come back a couple months later and they go, hey, things are going well, but we're kind of like hitting these walls with, say, .NET MAUI. And it's just like, okay, well, yeah, let's spin up your code. Show me what you're working on. And you're just like, oh God, oh God, oh no. Like you're doing it all wrong. And it's because well, not intentionally, but we laid a bad foundation for him. So
right.
that's the other thing with maintainability is think about the next developer who might not know what to do. They haven't been to conferences or they didn't
Mm-mm.
work at Xamarin like I do, and so they don't have all that inside knowledge,
Right.
and they're just kind of copy paste what they got and what they see. And there's nothing wrong with that. I still do
Yeah,
that.
you don't get far in this industry without that, right?
Yeah.
But you bring up another interesting point, right? So a while back on the Twitterverse, there was a back and forth with David Fowler about people writing samples and putting so much ceremony in the samples. And while I agree with a lot of his points, the thread that stuck with me and the reason why I go through the ceremony is I never know who's consuming it. And I don't assume that the person looking at my code knows more than me, right? I don't make that assumption. I make the assumption that the person that looking at the code is looking at it, trying to understand what is this thing and why is this person pitching it, right? What is the value? And they'll take my code right off the public internet and slam it into their application. I know because I've done it. I can't tell you how many times I've done a Stack Overflow, grabbed some code, wrote a unit test to make sure that it works for my requirements, and then boom, I'm jazzing again, right? No problem with that. The issue is that person comes back to me, like you said, 2-3 years later, says, hey, Rodney, I was working on something that you left behind. And I'm like, dude, you didn't copy that. Not that. Like, of all the things I did, you're going to copy that one thing that's the biggest black eye I've got. And you just, all right, let's work through it. So I try to make it easier for myself, right? Again, the maintenance burden on me is like, if you take good code from the beginning, makes it easy. Yeah. So you're going to show me how to take this simple app that has a lot of boilerplate code. Like, let's scroll down to the bottom of that view model just so I can get an understanding of the number of lines.
How many lines are we looking at?
Over 100 lines of code. How many lines of code is it? How many lines of code? 137 lines of code in order to make that thing, that UI, right? Okay,
right.
Cool. So now we know. Now we have a starting point of what we're looking at.
Yeah, and so yeah, let's just start hacking at it. So we can let's do the commands first, because commands, again, so much ceremony involved, because really all the logic's happening in this method. Like if I go to, it's not going to go there for me. There we go. Of course, if I go to my game button tap method, like this is really what's happening when you tap the button. But yeah, again, I had to create a property called game button tap command. I had to initialize it just to point to this method. So we've already got that method written. Mm-hmm. And with the MVVM toolkit, we can just delete this, and we just go straight to our method where, for being honest, like this is where we actually wrote the code, and we just slap a relay command attribute on it. And what the MVVM toolkit is doing for us now is writing that code for us. So let's see, I got some red squiggles. Let's make sure. Okay, so up here, this first red squiggle, this is really important. And actually, again, the guy who makes this library, Sergio, I love you, Sergio. I hope you never stop. He's crazy smart, but also he's thought of every mistake that I'm going to make using his toolkit. And he's added in analyzers and code fixes for us. So one of the big things, yeah, right. Which I've done those. They're not easy. If you ever had to write an analyzer,
well, I've written a couple.
My goodness.
So before we go any further, it's funny that you say that, right? Like I actually think that writing analyzers is easier than writing source generators.
Yeah, that's fair. Source generators are just a whole different beast, but
man,
speaking of source generators, so the reason I'm getting an error here is because I'm missing the word partial. And this might be a keyword you've never used before, because like, what the heck is a partial class? And honestly, really before the MVVM toolkit, I had the same sentiment. I was like, I've seen it before, especially with XAML. XAML uses partial classes, but other than that, I was like, I don't know when I would ever use it. So what's happening now behind the scenes is the MVVM toolkit is writing all that boilerplate code for us just because I slapped this relay command attribute on here. So in a separate partial class that is using source generators to automatically write the code for me, is he's creating that public property. He's wiring that property up to this method. There is something we need to include because remember I said
can't execute. Yep.
Yeah, so can't execute, and this looks a little strange because we're in the attribute, so I can't point it to a Boolean. But what I can do is point it or give it the name of the property.
Right.
So what was it? Can game button command execute.
There you go.
So I just tell it, hey, here's the name of the property, and then again, these source generators go through and write all this code for me. Like they figure it out. They figure out that this is a bool. You can point it to methods that return a bool. It does it all for you. And what gets really, really cool. So obviously we just saved ourselves a bunch of code because again, this method is the actual business logic. This is the actual code we're writing.
Mm-hmm.
And now to make it MVVMable and create that command, we just one line of code, slap an attribute on it. But here we've got this bool, and we can start refactoring all these properties. Because again, like all we had to do was create a public property because that's what MVVM requires for bindings. But
Mm-hmm.
to do that, we have to create a backing field, and we have to check to see if the property changes. So what we can do with the MVVM toolkit is we can get rid of all these properties too. So I can add an attribute here to let the toolkit know, hey, this field, I want you to make it an observable property. So it's writing all that code for me again. It's creating that public property. It's doing the iNotify property change stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that's cool is, again, anytime this changes, we need to let that command know that the change happened.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another, got notify can execute changed for, and we give it the command name, which, by the way, remember, all I wrote was a method called game button tapped.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the way the source generators work, it's going to create a command with the same name, added command at the end. So game button tapped command is the auto-generated name for it.
Right.
So if I tell it here that, hey, by the way, I've got this command, and I also need you to tell it that anytime the value here changes, to also call, was it raised execute can change, or I forget what the method is, but to let the command know that it can change.
I can't execute changed, I think is.
There we go. Yeah. let it know that it can execute change. And again, there's just another attribute. And so I don't know here. Let's give this a shot. I don't know if it'll build because we've been
Let's find out.
Slicing and dicing, but that doesn't matter too much because what I really want to show you is all this auto-generated code is actually visible. So if we dig into, I think it's the obj file. So
yep.
Look at this. So these generated files, and we're using a couple of source generators. So, Community Toolkit.MAUI and MAUI markup. I've written some source generators. Even the .MAUI team themselves uses source generators. But if we dig into the MVVM source generators, we can look at let's see. Here's our relay command generator. So this is. Oh no! Don't open it in Rider. Open it right behind you, man. Boom.
Okay. There we go.
Sure. Come on, Visual Studio Code. So yeah, here's the auto-generated code, and first thing we'll see is it says partial class tap game view model. So now this is where that partial keyword comes in handy because we're able to use source generators to basically bolt on things to my existing class, and again, here's that same ceremony. And, again, Sergio is way smarter than me. So he knows all the mistakes that could be made, and he'll do these properly. Like he initializes commands like this so that they kind of lazy load and increase your load times. He's one of those guys that if you ever look at the code for the MVVM toolkit, it's super low level. He's got benchmarks about how fast it is, and he tries to get rid of allocations. He's the man. His source generated code writes better code than I do. But yeah, so here's all that game button tap command that was written for me. If we look at the observable property generator, we can see all that same ceremony here. So here's that. Can game button tapped execute? It's that public bool that we didn't have to write. And it includes all these things so there's all these additional methods that fire on can game button execute changing. And this is how you're supposed to write your MVVM code, but rarely do any of us actually do it. But yeah, with the whole MVVM lifecycle, there's events that fire before it's changed. So that's the changing event. So you can say, oh, this is about to change. Maybe I want to make it red before it does, whatever. And then also after it does change, you let them know that it did change. And all this code is written for us. So he wrote 54 lines of code, and all I had to do was slap an attribute on there. And it's also handling there's my game button tapped command, notify, can execute change. So everything's there for me. And as we continue to go through, we can wipe out like more than half the code in um, in our code because we don't need it anymore. We can just do things like if I just slap this observable property here, I can make these observable properties, and then I'm just gonna start getting errors because it's like, hey, you've
I
got
already have it.
duplicates. Like
Hmm.
it's already generated these for me. So yeah, just blow them away, blow them away. This is the best part of maintaining code, in my opinion, is when you get to delete
Deleting
more
code
code.
is the best.
And let's see. Oh yeah, there's one more command we can blow away. Let's just do that. Let's see what our stats get to. So is update high score. Where's that method? There it is. Ryder's yelling at me. It's like you're not even using this anymore. Now
Right.
we are.
There we
So
go.
so yeah, actually that looks like it's going to build. I don't see any red squiggles, but I can pull up. I got my GitHub desktop here,
There you go.
and man, just like look at all this code we just got to delete, or better yet, code you never had to write in the first place. Like
Right.
our whole view model. What we start out at, Rodney? I forget, like
137.
137.
Yep. 137.
Now we're
Beautiful.
down to almost an even 100.
Beautiful.
And yeah, and like this is, and the best part is like the code that's left. Like this is actual
Code.
game engine code.
Code.
It's a simple game, so it's not like the Zelda game engine, but this is the code that actually matters. Whereas everything else was just ceremony and just extra boilerplate code that we had to do because somebody created MVVM and said this is the right way to make apps, which again I totally agree with. but
Why?
but you have to write all this extra code and duplicate code, and now it just does it for you. And I'll also mention here, so I'm not doing it here, but usually my fields look like this. I'm the guy that likes to use the underscore,
Yeah.
and that's totally cool too. So the MVVM toolkit's smart enough to know basically how to convert this into a property called tap count. So
Right.
it'll remove the underscores if you're an underscore guy. And obviously, if you're not, then it just capitalizes the first letter for the property name. But it's so beautiful. It makes my life so much easier. And actually, I didn't even show you this in the slides. I included a screenshot. So this is one of the apps I have in the App Store. It's called Git Trends. Shameless plug, but if you have a lot of GitHub repos in that you maintain, you manage, I made Git Trends to help you be able to do that. So Git Trends will help you monitor how many views, how many clones, how many stars, where the traffic's coming from. It'll send you push notifications if one of your repos blows up because we mentioned Git Trends here on the podcast, and now everybody's going to my open source repo. But it's a real app. It's in the App Store,
Nice.
and I made this before the MVVM toolkit existed. Um,
Nice.
and then once I found out about it, I was like, oh my goodness, and went through, and I got to delete 657 lines of code and
Mm,
only added. I mean, you still have to add a couple lines because we're adding in the attributes, but
yep, that's fine.
man, so much easier, so much more maintainable.
Hmm.
There's a little bit of magic, but the thing I like the most with source generators is the magic's there, but also the real code is too. And
Right.
like, if you ever were to even, we pulled up Finder and we dug into the bin and obj files to
Hmm.
hunt down that source generated code. But, if I went to, let's see, if I go back up to my page, because, you know, this is the view code. And it doesn't know any different. It just still knows it's pointing to this property called high score.
Hmm.
But yeah, you can even say go to declaration, and it'll even take you directly
To
to the
the yep.
generated code. So
Yep.
if you had no idea this code was generated, you're a brand new developer, you're just trying to figure out this new code base that you're responsible with maintaining. If you just right click on it, you'll see here's the actual code. Like there's no behind the scenes magic that it sometimes feels like there is, even with MVVM. So I love it, man. I can't tell you enough how much this one library has improved my life.
Let's talk about the magic, right? Because okay, so because I'm that guy, right? So like, um, Bodhi, amazing, 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 right?
Right.
And so now here's my argument, right? Well, it's not really arguments. It's my my own conundrum. I guess I'll call it, right? I don't care for Fody because I got yelled at a long time ago in a previous life for creating IL specific packages for specific customers in a SaaS application.
Whoa, dude.
If you don't know what I'm saying, basically what I'm telling you is in a SaaS application, every customer was running their own specific code base. Not a good idea, right? There's a long story to that.
So
I
we
can tell
call it
you,
playing with
right?
fire.
Right?
You're gonna get burned.
But that's exactly it. So like you when you're rewriting code, there's a different set of concerns, a different set of trade-offs, right? When you have to take someone's code and rewrite it at the IL level, right? Which is kind of what your Fodies and your Fody Weavers do, right? Which,
Mhm.
for the record, it predates source generators. It is amazing for what it is and what it was, and I still use it in certain things today. Now let's talk about source generators in this magic, right? That partial keyword is a big thing for me, right? I actually did know what the partial keyword was before, and I was not a fan of it because it has been so. Imagine a much younger version of myself that doesn't understand any of the good things that I know today. And I was like, oh yeah, I can use this partial keyword and I can create different, I can create this, I can
Oh
create,
no.
well, I can use different named files, but use the same class and section off different portions of my logic for a given class. Yeah. So, well, because because once you make it partial, there's no limit, right? You can put, if you want to put the logic across 50 files, you can do that. And I'm not going to say I did it, but I wasn't as good a steward then as I am now. So that partial keyword, when I came to source generators, gave me a lot of pause. But when I saw the value, right, the reality of it is that a Fody, the Fody magic is taking your code and rewriting your IL, right? But the source generator magic is saying, I'm taking the current file that you have and I am generating code for it, which is completely different. You're not modifying anything, right? So this is the difference between like that open close principle, that open to extension, close to modification. The way this is, you cannot modify it. It's closed to modification. Your code that you write is closed to modification. What we do is because we have that partial keyword, we extend your code into another class and give you a completely new set of behaviors. And that's the real magic to me with source generators, right? Because you can now really, you're using open close principle at a whole different layer, right? A whole different level. And you're getting solid like you've never been before. You're doing it with way less code on your part because this is the funny part because I've worked on a couple of source generators, and that 33 through 47, so that's 14 lines of code. So 20 lines of code. The code that it takes to write that 20 lines of code is like 200 lines of code. So it takes somebody really, like you said, Sergio is a genius because he's thinking ahead, right? Like it really takes somebody with a lot of foresight to understand what your code needs to look like, what the correct way it comes to, like, and then making analyzers to make sure that when you have fallen into a trap, they can bring you out of that trap and give you a path back to safety. So the magic here with these source generators is really kind of next level because they're giving you the opportunity, and it was hard for me because I'm used to having like the public property and then you have it generate the private stuff, right? Well, you can't do that with this way. Like you have to do it in an inverted way, right? Getting back to solid. Like now we're inverting the control flow and it really does. I mean, it really is magic, but it's not magic. It's actually understanding the C# language in a completely different way. Like business developers, right? Like a line of business application, your requirements are going to be generated based upon what the business requires, right? But when you're writing source generators, you're actually writing code based upon what a code file requires. And those are your requirements and the boundaries. So it's not magic. It just looks like magic because you have to train your brain to look at the code file and say, these are my requirements. I have to be inside the bounds of a C# file. So what does that mean? That means I have method declarations and invocation expressions and all of these things that are proper syntax that the compiler understands, but I don't do compilers for a living. So it's hard for me, right? It really does take a person that understands language to really excel when it comes to source generators. So if you want to get into this
Yes.
magic and understand it, go understand what it takes to put together a C# file at the syntax level.
Yeah, and truly, like again, all of this is open source. So yeah, if we wanted to, we could jump into like let's see, GitHub.net Community Toolkit.
There you go.
There we go.
There you go.
So yeah, like this is our Community Toolkit org, and this is where you can find any Community Toolkit dot NuGet package. But yeah, there's Sergio. Man,
There's Sergio. Hey,
shout
Sergio.
out, buddy. So
Thanks,
glad,
man.
so glad he's doing it. But yeah, like all these source generators, he's got them open source. So
Yep.
I mean, I don't know if we'll be able to find
There it is right there.
observable property generator. Boom. And it's weird. It kind of breaks your brain because you've probably never thought about writing code that generates code. Like we
I
always
haven't.
write code that executes something or that a user's going to use. And like this is kind of what it looks like, and it's weird, and the documentation's not great,
No,
but
it's not.
you can cheat like I do and take Sergio's code. And like we were saying earlier, you just copy paste somebody else's code,
There you
you
go.
tweak it a little bit to do what you want, and then what happened to me was I was telling Rodney before the show because he was like, "I want to ask you questions about source generators. I know you've built some." I was like, "Yeah, but the ones I built were so bad and so performance
Intensive.
intensive that the .NET engineering team literally opened a PR on the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit modifying the source generator because it was using so many allocations and that's the thing you got to keep in mind. These things run in the background nonstop. So
Mm-hmm.
every time we type a letter, like anytime we edit our code file,
Mm-hmm.
this has to run to again see if anything changed and it has to do anything. So our source generators from the Maui Community Toolkit is just running. And apparently it's using way too much memory and allocations because I put a link statement in. So they did things like unfurl the link statement into a for each loop to improve the performance. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can burn yourself, but also the benefits are so incredible. But I'm not going to try and explain how to write these here because it's tough and the documentation's not great. At least
Well,
when I was building them back in the day.
I mean, it's
Um,
still not great. So it's funny. I have a very similar story to you. Yeah. So I've been working on some source generators with Glenn and from the Reactive UI team, right? And we've been working on some source generators, and he got some feedback from the .NET team very similar, where hey, this is not going to be performant, and it's just like, well, we're following what little documentation is available. I mean, if you want us to do better, you got to give us better. You like show me the documentation, show me where I can get performance metrics. Show me an example of how I can do this correctly based upon your standards, or I'm going to continue to foul it up. In your case, you were lucky enough that you were crashing Visual Studio, so it was good for them to fix that one, right? But they're not going to fix mine. They're not going to care. I'm like, man, uninstall that.
yeah, here's your problem. Yeah, and truly, like, because when I think source generators were introduced in .NET 5, if I remember correctly, and then in
Sounds right.
.NET 6, they came out with what's called an incremental source generator. So,
Yeah.
so back in .NET 5 days, those first source generators basically had to rerun the entire time. So it couldn't really detect what changed, and it couldn't really do a diff to make these small incremental tweaks or burn through less of your CPU. And so, yeah, when I was creating our source generators for the .NET MAUI Community Toolkit, we wanted to use the incremental source generators because we knew that they were better for performance and
Mm-hmm.
we didn't want to blow up your machine.
Right.
And I'm going through it, and there's literally no documentation on it. Like, all I see is this interface is documented called I incremental source generator. And I was happy to be fortunate enough to I was a Microsoft employee at the time. I could reach out to the Roslyn team directly, and I did. Like guys like Jared Parsons, like, hey man, like, what's up? How do I know how to do this? Because it's so different from the iSource generator implementation in .NET 5. And he's like, oh, well, we haven't released the docs yet, but here's a private repo where you can find some things. And again, like, I was an employee, so I was able to kind of back my way into it. But yeah, there was nothing on like docs.microsoft.com. There
Mm-mm.
was, and even I haven't checked in about a year, but last time I was playing around with source generators, all the documentation was still just in a GitHub repo,
Mhm.
which good luck finding that. Like if I didn't literally reach out to the team,
Right.
the engineering team,
Right.
and they didn't give me the link, like Google's not going to pull up that information for you. Like GitHub's not a good spot to store docs like that. Like we need them on web pages so that they can be searchable. And but it's tough, but they're super powerful.
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny because like even I'm looking at the documentation that I was linked just yesterday, and it's basically just an interface definition that tells me I got to read through it and figure out how it works, right? Like it's exactly that. Oh, there you go.
Yep. Yeah, I want to bring this up one more time because I saw we're coming up to the top of the hour. So if you hadn't had a chance yet, codetraveler.io/community-toolkit is where you
Mhm.
can find all this stuff. You can find the code for the sample app we showed off with the finished MVVM attributes all in place. You can find links to our documentation. All of our docs for the Community Toolkit exist on the official Microsoft docs, which is kind of cool. So like me as a .NET developer at AWS, I can contribute to the Microsoft docs. But it's all available. So if you missed anything, or if you want to dive even deeper into the MVVM toolkit, the .MAUI toolkit, the .MAUI markup toolkit for making C# UIs, it's all there. You can find everything at codetraveler.io/community-toolkit.
Nice. Well, Brandon, thank you again for coming and hanging out with us. It's always a pleasure. And I will be using the Maui Community Toolkit coming up. I've actually got a Xamarin app that I wrote about 2 years ago that I'm about to port over to Maui because I need to make updates to it anyways. I'm like,
It's tough,
okay, here we
man.
go. So
I'm
so
working on that
I'm actually
now.
I'm gonna do the whole thing though because like I use XAML because XAML is what people do in our industry, but I much prefer C# UI. It's how I started. It makes more sense to me. Like it's just code. Life is easy. So I intend to run this through some paces and see what I can make work with. But I'm excited about this, and I'm grateful to community members like yourself and Sergio that make tools like this available to developers like me who don't want to have to write this code all the time, every single app. Like, there's a certain point where I'm doing file new project at least 2-3 times a week, building different samples and, helping people out, and even just having to rebuild things to prove that this thing works or doesn't work in isolation, right? So having something that reduces the complexity and my time is something that I appreciate a lot. So, go out there, folks, try the community toolkit, give them feedback. Hey, I love it. Hey, I don't like it. Here's why. These are things that I want to add. These are things that I wish I would like. Give them feedback. The best thing you can do as a consumer is give feedback, both positive and negative. We prefer the positive, but the negative is understandable.
Yeah, gotta get it.
We get it. We're developers too, but give us feedback because that helps us understand how we can better make your experience, right? We can make your experience better through that feedback and through that dialogue. So please reach out to
Yeah,
Brandon
absolutely.
and let him know what you think.
Yeah, like I said, it's called the Community Toolkit for a reason. There's about 10 maintainers along with me that work on the Maui toolkits, and there's a couple of us that work at Microsoft or used to work at Microsoft in my
Mhm.
case, but most of us don't. And most of the code written for this code base is by folks in the community. So
Mhm.
it's very much driven by whatever the community wants, whatever the community has the time to contribute.
Right.
We want all of it. So we're happy to maintain it. We'll help fix bugs in the future because every code's going to have bugs. So don't worry about it if you submit a PR with some bugs in it, or we're going to try and catch them. And if we don't, we'll fix them in the future. But yeah, man, it's a really cool effort. And like I said, there's been just dozens of maintainers over the years who have all chipped in, and even folks who aren't official maintainers. That we've got a guy Kenji. I think he's based in Japan, and he's just been crushing code for the community toolkit. Like
Nice.
I. I've had to review so many of his PRs lately that like I'm exhausted, but it's such a good problem to have because
It is.
there's he's knocked out dozens of bug fixes that people have been asking for forever that
Oh,
they're
that's
on the
great.
list, but again, we're just volunteers. So it's whenever we have time to get around it.
Right.
Kenji stepped up and boom, he's just crushing it. So thank you, Kenji, and thank you to anybody else out there who comes and helps contribute.
Yeah, awesome. Well, again, Brendan, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate you showing off what's going on in the community toolkit and in the MAUI space, because that's the space that I play in the most.
Thanks so much for having me again, Rodney. And yeah, happy to come back anytime to hawk my wares and show off the libraries I make and or push apps that I've published to the App Store.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely get you back to talk about some fun things, right? I actually kind of want to talk about your serverless stack, right? Because I've been playing with more mobile apps, just side things and ideas that I've had for years, just trying to prove out like how I would want to do it. And I'm sitting there wondering, like, AWS seems like a good platform.
And
So
serverless,
maybe we'll talk
it's
about
easy,
your
it's cheap.
serverless setup for mobile apps on AWS sometime.
Heck yeah! I mean, it's so easy. A mobile app developer can do it. So and
I like
and
that
literally
one.
the bill's cheap too. That's my main reason because my apps in the App Store they're free, but every mobile app needs a back end in the cloud somewhere. So
Somewhere.
with serverless, there's things called cold start times you got to be aware of, and we'll dive into all that in a future episode. But yeah, highly recommend it because it makes again just makes your life easier.
Awesome. Well, now you've got a preview into what we'll be talking about next time with Brandon. This has been another episode of Inside.net. Thanks for watching.